We're talking today with author, church historian, and missiologist David Garrison about his new book, A Wind in the House of Islam, due to be released later this year. David, in section 1, we talked about how you set the parameters for what counted as a movement, as opposed to just a few Muslims becoming followers of Jesus. What does section 2 of your book discuss?
Well, section 2 takes us from setting the stage to actually diving into the House of Islam. And we've identified 9 rooms in the House of Islam, 9 distinct cultural zones within that house. And what we've done now is we've gone into the rooms in historical order from the first movement of Muslims to Christ, which took place in the Indo-Malaysia room. We go into that and examine what happened, why did it happen after 1,300 plus years of no movements. And then we jump over into East Africa. We look at the second movement that takes place just a few years after that. And then we bring it right up to the present and look at the many, many movements today with a lot of interviews of Muslim background believers, sheikhs, imams, former jihadis who have come to faith in Christ.
I'm particularly interested in Iran. There seems to be a pretty rapidly growing church there. What's the reason for that?
God is real, and Jesus is real, and Iranians are meeting Jesus. You know, it's the most amazing thing. It's above everything else. It's not methods, it's not tactics. All those things have a role to play, and I don't want to minimize them. But at the end of the day, Jesus is either alive or he's not. And he is, and they meet him and they encounter him, and he fills that void in their heart. He answers their prayers. People have been healed. People have had experiences with Christ that they say, you know, I can never go back because I know him now and he knows me. So that's the bottom line. Now you can add to that the importance of satellite television, radio broadcast, the Jesus film, courageous gospel witness that's come from organizations and individuals that have pressed the gospel forward, martyrs, people who have laid down their life inside Iran for the gospel, and the tremendous influence that their witness and their martyrdom has had.
So how is God working in Persia today?
Well, it's remarkable what's happening there. You know, it's probably no exaggeration to say the greatest evangelist in the history of Muslim Iran, which would date back to the 7th century, died just a few years ago. His name was the Ayatollah Khomeini. And I say that because Khomeini showed Iranians what austere, rigid, harsh, often cruel Islam could be. And many would say, well, that's an aberration, that's not Islam. Well, it's certainly not Islam at its best, but it's the Islam under which, you know, more than 60 million Iranians suffer today. And so many, many Iranians are saying, if that's Islam, then I must be a Christian, or I must be a Zoroastrian, or something else. And they're just walking away from that harsh form of Islam.
One of the things you write is that Westerners mistakenly believe that Muslims struggle with loyalty to either Jesus or Muhammad. But this is rarely the case. Why?
It's so exciting, you know, this is one of those wonderful discoveries, because we think that somehow in the Muslim world, Jesus and Muhammad are in competition. But once a Muslim comes to faith in Christ, once he meets the Christ of his dreams, of his visions, of his answered prayers, Jesus is in a whole different category. Now, whether or not he's got all of his theology worked out about the incarnation and the Trinity, that's a separate issue, but there's no comparison between who Jesus is and the one who's found him and saved him and redeemed him, and who Muhammad was.
Well, you tell the story of one man who I thought was very interesting, because you say in your book that he found Jesus in the Quran and realized that the Quran spoke more about Jesus than it did about Muhammad. Is that right?
Oh yeah, 96 references to Jesus in the Quran.
So tell me a little bit more about this.
Well, that's been surprising. You know, again, we tend to compare the Quran with the Bible. Which one will be the authority? The fact of the matter is, for Muslims, there is no question. The Bible is just a book. The Quran is their authority, but they don't understand the Quran. I would venture 90% of Muslims from one end of the Muslim world to the other don't really understand 7th century Arabic, which is what the Quran consists of. And consequently, it's almost like a magical book. They revere it, they hallow it, they'll do whatever they think it says, and they get manipulated as a result. What's been striking is across the Muslim world, as Muslims are reading the Quran in their own language, in Urdu or in Bangla or in Bahasa Indonesia or in some language that they really understand, we've had Muslim after Muslim after Muslim who says, I read it cover to cover and I realized for the first time, I'm lost. Because there is no assurance of salvation in the Quran. It never was intended for that. And once they realize there's no assurance of salvation, no clear offer of salvation, they set it aside and they go looking for salvation.
Tell me now, what is section 3 of your book about?
What we've done in this book, we've said we're going to take a phenomenological approach, which means we're going to suspend our judgments. We're going to just describe accurately what's happening, what the situation is. Well, we do that in section 2. We describe room by room by room how God is at work, what's going on, what are these stories, letting them speak for themselves without bringing judgment on what's happening. We do evaluation. We say, what have we learned? How is God at work in these rooms? What are the patterns we can see? Is there anything that is new and exciting that we didn't anticipate? Are there things that we need to be asking ourselves, should we be doing things differently? So that's what the final section is, and to me that's really where the rubber hits the road. It's how should we then live? Where do we go from here? What do we do in light of how God is at work in this unprecedented way today?
The book is A Wind in the House of Islam, due to be released later this year.